The old American dream was built on a very simple belief. If you worked full-time, you would be able to afford a place to live. Not luxury, not wealth, just stability. That belief survived recessions, inflation spikes, wars, and political change. For generations, Americans could disagree on almost everything else and still quietly trust one thing underneath it all: a person with a job could build a life. That assumption is now collapsing in real time. And the numbers behind it are so extreme that most people still have not emotionally processed what they actually mean. Right now, there is not a single major metropolitan area in the United States where a full-time worker earning the federal minimum wage can afford a modest one-bedroom apartment without being considered cost-burdened. Not one. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, in many parts of the country, workers would need to log the equivalent of 2 full-time jobs just to afford basic rent at standard affordability levels. Think about what that means psychologically. A person can do exactly what society told them to do: wake up early, work every day, stay employed, avoid trouble, and still mathematically fail to secure housing. That changes how people experience work itself. Because work stops feeling like progress. It starts feeling like survival without movement. And once that shift happens across millions of households at the same time, the effects spread far beyond housing. You can actually see it in the financial behavior of ordinary Americans. People are delaying medical care, skipping dental visits, ignoring maintenance on cars they depend on for work, using credit cards for groceries, taking on buy now pay later debt for essentials. Not because they are reckless, because the math no longer leaves room for error. For decades, economists used a simple rule: housing should consume no more than 30% of a household's income. Beyond that threshold, financial instability rises sharply. Today, millions of renters are spending 40%, 50%, even 60% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. And once half your income disappears into rent, every other part of life becomes fragile. A flat tire becomes a crisis. A missed week of work becomes dangerous. A medical deductible becomes catastrophic. The margin disappears first. Then the stability disappears after it. What makes this crisis psychologically different from previous downturns is that it does not feel temporary anymore. During the 2008 financial crash, millions lost jobs, but there was still a widespread belief that recovery would eventually restore normal life. Housing was damaged, but the underlying social contract still felt intact. Now the fear is different. People are working. The economy, on paper, is technically functioning. Unemployment is relatively low compared to historic crises. And yet housing insecurity keeps spreading anyway. That contradiction is deeply unsettling to people because it breaks the relationship between effort and outcome. And when human beings stop believing effort guarantees stability, anxiety spreads fast, especially among younger workers. For many Americans under 40, home ownership no longer feels delayed. It feels fictional. The median home price in the United States has risen dramatically over the last decade, while mortgage rates surged after 2021. In practical terms, families who could have afforded a home payment a few years ago suddenly found themselves priced out almost overnight. A house that may have cost $1,600 a month to finance at ultra-low pandemic-era interest rates could suddenly require payments approaching double that amount once rates climbed above 7%. The house did not change. The salary often did not change. But the monthly cost changed so violently that millions simply fell out of the market instantly. That matters because when people cannot buy homes, they remain renters longer. And when more people compete for rentals at the same time inventory remains limited, rents rise even faster. This is why the crisis feels self-reinforcing. Every pressure point feeds another pressure point. Higher rates push people out of ownership. More renters increase demand. Higher demand drives rent increases. Higher rents destroy savings. Destroyed savings prevent future ownership. The cycle loops back into itself. And meanwhile, wages simply did not keep pace. Yes, incomes rose nominally in recent years. But when adjusted against housing, healthcare, insurance, transportation, and food costs, many households experienced something very different emotionally. They felt poorer while technically still employed. That emotional contradiction matters more than politicians often realize. Because people judge stability through lived experience, not economic headlines. If groceries suddenly cost dramatically more, if insurance premiums rise, if rent renewals jump hundreds of dollars, if debt interest compounds faster than savings, then a strong economy becomes something people hear about, not something they feel. And that gap between official economic narratives and lived reality is fueling a deeper kind of frustration now spreading across the country, especially among people who once considered themselves financially safe. Teachers, nurses, warehouse workers, delivery drivers, office employees, retirees. People who are not traditionally associated with economic collapse are now finding themselves one emergency away from instability. And when that realization spreads socially, something else begins happening. People stop thinking in long-term plans. They stop imagining 5 years ahead. They stop imagining retirement. They stop imagining ownership. Instead, life becomes shorter-term and defensive. Can I survive this month? Can I make next rent? Can I avoid one more financial hit? That psychological contraction is one of the clearest warning signs of a society under sustained economic pressure. And there is another reason this crisis keeps accelerating even while many Americans continue working full-time. The cost of debt exploded at the exact same moment housing became unaffordable. Because just as millions were struggling to keep up with rising rent, interest rates across the entire economy suddenly surged all at once. And that changed everything. The timing could not have been worse. Because Americans did not enter this housing crisis financially healthy. They entered it carrying record levels of debt. For years, cheap borrowing had quietly become the glue holding household budgets together. Credit cards covered emergencies. Auto loans stretched longer. Buy now, pay later services normalized installment payments for basic purchases. Student debt followed millions deep into adulthood. And during the era of ultra-low interest rates, many families convinced themselves they could manage it because monthly payments still felt survivable. Then the interest rates changed. Fast. Between 2021 and 2024, the Federal Reserve raised rates aggressively to fight inflation, and the effect hit ordinary Americans like a financial shockwave moving through every category of life at the same time. Mortgage rates jumped from below 3% to above 7%. Auto loan rates surged into double digits for many borrowers. Credit card interest climbed past 20%, with some cards crossing 25% or higher. Suddenly, debt stopped feeling manageable. And here is what makes compounding debt psychologically dangerous. People often do not realize they are losing until months after the damage has already started. A family pays the minimum balance. The balance barely moves. Interest quietly absorbs the payment. Another emergency arrives. The card gets used again. From the outside, everything still looks normal. People keep going to work. They keep paying what they can. They keep trying to hold the structure together. But internally, the math begins collapsing. And debt today is not just a financial burden. It is increasingly a housing barrier. That is the part many Americans still do not fully understand. A landlord does not simply ask whether you can pay rent now. They examine your entire financial history. Credit score, collections, debt-to-income ratios, evictions, auto delinquencies, medical balances. A person can earn enough money to afford an apartment and still be denied housing because their financial profile signals risk. That changes the nature of economic insecurity entirely. Because now financial hardship follows people long after the original emergency is over. A medical issue from 2 years ago can block housing today. A temporary layoff can damage credit long enough to trigger future instability. One missed payment can snowball into multiple closed doors. And once someone falls out of stable housing, recovering becomes exponentially harder. Without an address, basic systems start breaking down. Job applications become harder. Banking becomes harder. Healthcare becomes harder. Even maintaining personal hygiene becomes a logistical challenge. This is why modern homelessness increasingly looks less like sudden collapse and more like gradual financial suffocation. People do not simply become homeless overnight. Usually, there is a long chain of invisible compromises first. Savings disappear. Debt rises. Bills get prioritized. Repairs get delayed. Credit weakens. Housing options shrink. Then one final shock arrives, and the structure gives way. And often, the trigger is something disturbingly ordinary. A transmission failure. A surgery. A rent increase. A reduction in work hours. A divorce. A hospitalization. That is what makes this crisis so psychologically powerful. Most people can imagine one bad month. Most people can imagine one unexpected bill, which means most people can suddenly imagine themselves inside the story. And that is exactly why vehicle living has exploded across parts of America. Because for many households, the vehicle becomes the last remaining form of private shelter still accessible without approvals, deposits, or credit checks. No landlord interview. No application fee. No background screening. Just a locked door. That is why RV sales surged during parts of the housing squeeze. For some families, buying an older camper or van did not feel like a lifestyle choice. It felt like financial strategy. At first, the math appeared rational. An older RV might cost less upfront than securing a traditional apartment in a high-cost city. No first-month rent. No security deposit. No lease escalation. No aggressive screening process. For households already locked out of rentals, the vehicle looked like an escape hatch. But underneath that decision, another trap was forming. Because many of those vehicles were financed with high-interest loans stretching years into the future. And unlike houses, RVs depreciate rapidly. The vehicle loses value. The loan balance stays high. Repair costs begin stacking up. Then reality arrives. Roof leaks. Electrical failures. Transmission problems. Water damage. Broken generators. Heating failures during winter. Repairs that can cost thousands on assets already worth less than the debt attached to them. And when payments fall behind, repossession becomes more than losing transportation. It becomes losing shelter itself. That is the hidden brutality inside the vehicle living crisis. A tow truck can effectively erase someone's home in under an hour. And yet, despite all of this, the number of Americans living in vehicles continues growing because traditional housing has become inaccessible to more people than official narratives are willing to admit. What makes this phenomenon especially unsettling is how invisible it remains to much of society. Vehicle dwellers learn how to disappear. They rotate parking lots, arrive late, leave early, cover windows carefully, stay quiet, blend into ordinary traffic patterns. Many still work normal jobs. Many still send children to school. Many still appear outwardly stable during the daytime. That invisibility creates a dangerous illusion. Because most Americans still associate homelessness with visible street homelessness alone. But increasingly, the crisis is parked quietly in apartment overflow lots, truck stops, rest areas, suburban side streets, and retail parking lots all across the country, hidden in plain sight. And perhaps the most emotionally devastating part of this entire shift is who it is beginning to hit next. Not only young workers, not only struggling families, but people who already spent their entire lives believing they had done everything right. Retirees. For most Americans, retirement was supposed to represent the finish line. Not luxury, not yachts or vacation homes, just dignity. The promise was simple: work for decades, pay into the system, build savings slowly, and eventually reach a point where life becomes more stable instead of less. But for a growing number of older Americans, the exact opposite is happening. They are entering the most financially vulnerable years of their lives at the precise moment the cost of living is accelerating beyond what fixed incomes can handle. And once again, the math is brutal. Social Security benefits for many retirees average somewhere around $1,500 to $2,000 per month, depending on work history and retirement age. In large parts of the country, that barely covers rent alone now. Not utilities, not groceries, not medication, not insurance, just rent. And aging changes the equation in ways younger workers often underestimate. Older adults are more exposed to healthcare costs, more dependent on stable temperatures, more vulnerable to transportation problems, less able to recover financially after major setbacks. A 28-year-old who loses housing may still imagine rebuilding over time. A 68-year-old often understands there may not be enough time left economically to start over. That realization creates a kind of fear that is very different from ordinary financial stress. Because for many seniors, this is not about losing comfort. It is about losing the final layer of security they believe they had already earned. And healthcare costs are often the breaking point. An unexpected surgery, cancer treatment, long-term prescriptions, assisted care, insurance deductibles. Even insured retirees can face thousands of dollars in out-of-pocket costs almost instantly. Long-term care facilities in some parts of the United States now cost more per month than many Americans earned during their entire working careers. So people start making impossible trade-offs. They delay treatment, split medication doses, keep working far past retirement age, drain savings to survive one medical event, sell homes, move into vehicles, and once retirement savings disappear, rebuilding them is extraordinarily difficult. This is where the crisis becomes emotionally disorienting for many Americans watching it happen. Because older generations were traditionally viewed as the most financially secure demographic in the country. They benefited from cheaper housing eras, stronger pensions, and periods of higher purchasing power. But that assumption no longer protects many retirees against the modern cost structure of American life, especially renters. A homeowner with a paid-off mortgage may still survive rising inflation. A retiree entering old age while still renting faces a completely different reality. Every lease renewal becomes a threat. Every rent increase becomes destabilizing. And unlike younger workers, seniors often cannot simply work more to compensate. Physical limitations matter. Hiring discrimination matters. Energy matters. The economy still expects productivity from people whose bodies are slowing down while simultaneously increasing the cost of existing year after year. That contradiction is quietly producing one of the fastest growing groups within America's housing crisis. Older adults experiencing homelessness for the first time late in life. And when seniors lose housing, the consequences escalate quickly. Vehicle living is far more dangerous at older ages. Extreme heat becomes deadly faster. Cold temperatures become life-threatening. Lack of refrigeration affects medication. Poor sleep worsens existing conditions. Stress accelerates cognitive decline. Even basic survival tasks become physically exhausting when performed every day without stable shelter. Finding safe parking, accessing bathrooms, carrying water, managing hygiene, protecting belongings. Tasks that seem inconvenient for younger people can become overwhelming for older adults over months or years. And yet many still try to hide it. Because shame plays a huge role in this crisis, especially among older generations raised to associate financial hardship with personal failure. Many retirees experiencing housing instability do not tell family members immediately. Some hide it from friends. Others continue pretending everything is normal for as long as possible. That emotional isolation makes the crisis even harder to measure. And beneath all of this sits another uncomfortable truth. A huge percentage of Americans are financially unprepared for aging in the modern economy. For decades, wages stagnated while essential costs rose. Pension systems weakened. Healthcare costs climbed. Housing became increasingly financialized. Savings rates remained low because millions were already spending most of their income simply surviving the present. Which means many households entered older age without enough cushion to absorb prolonged inflation or major emergencies. Then inflation arrived aggressively after the pandemic years, and suddenly the vulnerabilities became visible all at once. Food prices rose sharply. Utilities climbed. Insurance costs increased. Property taxes rose in many regions. Medical expenses expanded. For retirees living on fixed incomes, every increase acts like a permanent pay cut. And unlike younger workers, there is often no realistic mechanism to offset those rising costs. This is why more seniors are quietly falling into hidden homelessness, sleeping in vehicles, rotating between relatives, living in motels, or surviving in unstable arrangements that rarely appear in official counts. The public image of homelessness still has not caught up with what the crisis actually looks like now, because increasingly, it includes people who spent 40 or 50 years participating exactly as society expected them to. And if that realization is disturbing, what happens to children inside this system may be even harder to confront. Because housing instability does not only affect where children sleep, it changes how they grow up.